Good morning, afternoon-ish. How are you? My name is Courtney Rose, and I am this year's Black Student Network President. And I just wanted to take a moment and welcome you all to the 6th Annual Diversity in Research and Practice Conference. It's so beautiful to see you all. How are you? So this year, BSN adopted the motto BSN Inc., INC, which stands for Impact, Network, and Community. And throughout the year, we planned events keeping these three pillars in mind. We did an event with Joe Rogers Jr. and the Total Equity Now organization in Harlem, focusing on bringing literacy awareness to Harlem. We did a walk with them, and that was really big for us to get us out into the community. We did a couple of think tanks this year, one in which we partnered with the Coalition of Latino Scholars, and we talked about representation of people of color in the literature that we use in our classrooms. That was really powerful, and we were lucky enough to have tons of newly admitted students there. And we also had our gala, our Black History Month gala this year that has grown tremendously, and we were so excited to see so many people that we see here tonight there at that event, joining us and partaking in that event with us. Today, we are here celebrating the work that we are doing, bringing awareness in so many different fields. Sorry, that was really loud. And we're just so pleased to have the opportunity for you guys to highlight the work that you've been doing over the last few years, and to share that with your peers and get feedback from your peers. So I hope you have the opportunity to stop to as many sessions as you can and really take in the day. At this time, I would like to introduce Ashley Maxey Mormon, who is our VP of Academic Affairs and the chair of this conference. So Ashley.
Hi everyone, I echo Courtney's sentiments. I'm excited to see you all here on a Saturday, and it's kind of nice outside, so hopefully we'll make up for that. I just want to talk about the theme that she mentioned for this year, Inc., Impact, Network, and Community. I specifically wanted to make sure that that was embodied in this conference throughout the day, making sure that we have a positive impact on you guys when you leave here, the conversations that we have and the learning that we do today. And then also that we network professionally, allow students to network with other students and faculty members at this conference today, and also that we keep in mind throughout the day to remember to connect our research and our practice to the community. And that's a really big thing. That's our theme, Bridging the Gap, Uniting Agents of Change. So making sure that when we're doing our research and we're doing our work, that we're collaborating with our community, and we're making sure that we're actually going into the places that we're talking about and that we're researching. So I want to, before I introduce our keynote, I wanted to acknowledge my committee members. They're around. Where are they? There's Jennifer, if you guys can raise your hands. Jennifer, Michael, Sarah, Mary, Philip. They did an amazing job. Albion. Where's everybody? Okay. They did an amazing job, so I just want to give them a round of applause. So now I'm just going to introduce our amazing keynote. I'm really excited to have him here today, Dr. Pedro Nogueira, and I will introduce him now. So he is the Peter L. Agnew Professor of Education at New York University. He holds tenured faculty appointments in the Departments of Teaching and Learning and Humanities and Social Sciences at the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Development at NYU. He is also the Executive Director of the Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity and the Transformation of Schools. Dr. Nogueira is the author of 8 books and over 150 articles and monographs. His most recent books are School for Resilience, Improving the Life Trajectory of African American and Latino Boys, Creating an Opportunity to Learn with A. Wade Boykin, and Invisible No More, Understanding and Responding to the Disenfranchisement of Latino Males with A. Hurtado and E. Fergus. Dr. Nogueira appears as a regular commentator on educational issues on CNN, MSNBC, National Public Radio, and other national news outlets. From 2009 to 2012, he served as trustee for the State University of New York as an appointee of the governor. He serves on the boards of numerous national and local organizations, including the Economic Policy Institute, the Young Women's Leadership Institute, the After School Corporation, and the Nation magazine. In 2013, he was appointed to the Kappa Delta Pi Honor Society. In 2014, he was also appointed to the National Academy of Education. Nogueira recently received awards from the Center for the Advanced Study of Behavioral Sciences for outstanding achievement in advancing the understanding of the behavioral and social sciences as they are applied to pressing social issues. The National Association of Secondary Principals for distinguished service to the field of education, and from the McSilver Institute at NYU for his research and advocacy efforts aimed at fighting poverty. Please welcome Dr. Pedro Nogueira.
Good morning. Morning still, right? It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank, first of all, the organizers. Thank Maxie. Thank my good friend Phil Smith and all the others who pulled this conference together. I know that this takes a lot of work. Thank all of you for coming out today. I know giving up a Saturday, not easy. It wasn't easy for me, so I imagine not easy for you. My casual attire is a reflection of the fact that I'm headed to go do casual things as soon as I leave here. I also appeared on MSNBC this way last Saturday, so I figured if I could do it on TV, I could definitely do it at a conference. So, so I hope you don't be offended by my, I'm not advertising Adidas, I just happen to wear the jacket. I want to do a big shout out to colleague, friend, former advisee, Yolanda Seeley Ruiz, professor here, who just got tenure. Where is she? Can we get a stale, please? She told me, first person in her department to get tenure through the ranks, not to come in with tenure in 25 years, unanimous decision. So, give Columbia a shout out to Teachers College for finally doing the right thing, so that's a good thing too. And then I also want to give a shout out to Lee and Low Books, Abe Barreto, who's in the back. Lee and Low is one of few, if not the only, national publisher of multicultural literature. And anybody who's in education knows how desperately our kids need to see literature that speaks about their experience, their identity, and brings some cultural relevance to their learning. And so I want to encourage all of you at some point to go take a look out there. He also has my new book, Excellence Through Equity, which I'll talk about in a moment if you're interested in that. So just a shout out for Abe. So I'm going to take the theme of your conference today, and I'm going to focus this Bridging the Gap, which is a nice kind of general theme, to talk about the gap between scholarship and practice, and how do we make sure we're doing scholarship that actually makes a difference. Because I think it's very easy when you're in academia to fool yourself into believing that you are, right? That you've arrived because you're at a place like Teachers College or NYU or some other institution, and lose sight of the fact that maybe no one is actually reading your work other than the people who are in your immediate field or your students that you make read the work, or that dissertation that you put your heart and soul into. Maybe your advisor's reading it, but who else? Right? Wow, that's kind of sobering, isn't it, right, when you think about it? And so it should force us to ask, are we doing work that's relevant? Are we doing work that matters? And given the great needs out there in our society and our communities, I don't think we should be content with just advancing our professional careers. All right? As important as it is to get tenure, to get a job, I don't want to deny that or diminish that by any means. I think that you should be interested in much more than that. And if you're not, you're selling yourself short. I I often say when I go to AERA, the American Educational Research Association meetings, where there are thousands of researchers from all across the country and across the world doing research in education, I wonder if there are this many people studying education, why are the problems so bad, right, in our schools? There's a disconnect out there. It's not to say there aren't scholars who aren't doing important work that is having an impact, who are engaged and trying to make sure that their work is meaningful and relevant. So I don't want to in any way suggest that that's not happening. I just think it's not happening enough. And part of the reason why it's not happening is because very often there's a fear in the academy. And a fear that if somehow your work is relevant to a broader audience, that it's not scholarly enough. Right? That is, if it could be understood by your mom or by a teacher, then maybe it's not really scholarly, because scholarly work is obtuse. Right? Scholarly work can only be understood by other scholars. In fact, the more obtuse, the better. Right? And I have a bias against that. I think that real scholarship is work that can have a real impact on the world. And it doesn't mean it shouldn't be sophisticated or rigorous. It doesn't mean that it shouldn't be engaging important issues. It must. But if it isn't about addressing the larger problem, particularly for scholars of color or for scholars and researchers who are just concerned about the state of the world, the state of our society, then I'd say that we are part of the problem. Right? And it's very easy to get caught up into thinking you're doing something that matters when in fact you're not. Wow, isn't that kind of harsh? And so I would say the big challenge we face is to use this privileged position of being in the academy to do work that's important. And sometimes I know there are a lot of people who don't think of this as a privileged position. And I say, well, then you probably never had a real job before, right? Because if you had a real job, right, where you have to show up to work every day, where you don't get your summers off, where you're worried about paying your bills, these jobs in academia are highly privileged, even if you're not at an elite institution, right? Even if you're at a community college, right? I know folks in community colleges who have nice, cush positions, cush in a relative sense, right? They might be teaching 4 courses a semester, right? But they still get the privilege of teaching students, right? And occasionally writing about what they want and having a lot of freedom to do what they think is important that other people who work in this country never have, right? Including a lot of teachers. Right? And I know right now it's a really, really hard time to be a teacher in this country. I put a post on my website yesterday because I spoke at an event in the Pittsburgh area that was aimed at trying to recruit more African-American males into the teaching profession, and I showed a picture with myself and some young men who were thinking about it, and it was interesting the responses the picture got from people who said they won't last. They're going to be beaten down, right? And that was from teachers, right? And while that's discouraging, anybody who's been a teacher knows it's hard work. It's especially hard right now because of bad policies, right, that make the work extremely discouraging. When you see what happened in Atlanta, right, just a week ago with the verdicts handed down to the teachers accused of cheating, not to say that cheating should be excused or should be taken lightly by any means, but we haven't had a banker go to jail yet in this country, right? And think how many police officers who've killed unarmed civilians have been unindicted, right? We've had teachers that have committed sex or had sex with children who have not gotten prison terms. And the judge had the nerve to say this was the biggest scandal ever in the history of Atlanta. I said, wow, he's not been paying attention then, right? But what was most disturbing to me is that as that trial unfolded and as Beverly Hall, who was once widely held up as the leading administrator in the country, received numerous awards for her achievements in Atlanta by the Obama administration, by the American Association of Superintendents, and many other groups. As that trial proceeded and she got sick, no one stood with her. No one stood with her. No one acknowledged that it wasn't just she who was putting the pressure on those schools for higher test scores, but it was also that governor, Sonny Perdue, who demanded more, and that Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, who said that by 2014, all the kids should be proficient. He only backed away from that a year ago. even though everyone knew it was never going to happen. And the sad thing about Atlanta is Atlanta was actually improving. Anybody knows Atlanta knows that under Beverly Hall's leadership, it got better. Park Middle School, that was the epicenter for the cheating, I spent time there. It went from being a highly dysfunctional school to a place that many of us would put our own children in. And it's proved by the NAEP scores. Right? And you can't cheat on NAEP, the National Assessment for Educational Progress. Atlanta had more progress than any other urban district in the country. Ask Mike Smith, the former Assistant Secretary of Education, the dean, former dean at Stanford School of Education, who actually wrote and said that. But when those educators got put on trial, everybody else acted like they didn't know them. Everybody else acted like it was just them. Right? And again, it's wrong to cheat, but there are a lot of wrongs out there. Right? And the biggest wrong is what we're doing to schools in the name of achievement. Right? That's the biggest wrong. And that's why it's so important for those of us who are not in the classroom now, who have the luxury of sitting back and thinking and writing about it and doing research, to research and write about that too. Because that abuse that's occurring to children, to schools, to educators, and why is it abuse? Because in the name of higher achievement, what are we seeing? We're not just seeing cheating. We're seeing a narrowing of the curriculum. Right? Why? Because anything not on the test is increasingly taken away from kids. Art's not on the test, so you see schools getting rid of art, getting rid of music, getting rid of physical education, getting rid of recess. At a time when obesity is the #1 health challenge, you go to schools that have eliminated recess and phys ed. Which schools? Schools serving poor kids of color. Right? In the name of higher test scores. It's crazy. But this is the path we've been on for a while. This is the path we're still on. Right? And so if researchers don't look at this, don't call attention to it, don't educate the broader public, not just each other, because the public is aware that something is wrong, but they're confused about these issues. They're honestly confused. That's the reason why not just Cuomo, but Christie and all the other governors can act like they are holding teachers accountable and ignore the fact that they're not accountable. Huh? Think about it. You know, Governor Cuomo was threatening to take over New York City schools that are not performing. He already controls schools in Roosevelt. Say, well, before you want more, show us what you've done. And Roosevelt is not the model for the nation. Hardly. And Governor Christie, he controls Newark, he controls Patterson, he controls Camden. When's the last time you heard him say, you know, I wish I could do something better for those kids in those cities? We have a system of accountability where those with the most power have no accountability, and those with the least have all of it. What kind of system is that? So if we don't call attention to what's going on, I think that we've become complicit in our silence. So my own journey as a scholar who's tried to have an impact through my work, I think is illustrative of what I would hope that many of us would be trying to do. Not to say I figured it out, but I'm still trying to figure out how to have an impact through the work. Right? And the way I went about it was almost inadvertently, because my field is not education, my field is sociology. And I wasn't studying schools initially. I was studying politics in the Caribbean. Right? I was doing research in Grenada, trying to understand the political changes taking place there and other islands. But I was involved in schools. I was teaching. I was working with schools in the Bay Area. I was doing that more for social and political reasons, not for my academic reasons. And so when I finished my degree, I was actually on the market looking around for jobs like graduate students do, right, when you finish. And I was recruited to come to Berkeley. And they had just created a new division of social and cultural studies. It was basically the division for the people they didn't know what to do with, right? The historians, the philosophers, the sociologists, the anthropologists. And I was asked to join them. I said, well, why not? And the misfits I fit right in with them, right? Because I wasn't a conventional with respect to the way I was looking at educational issues. From the very beginning, I took the position that in order to understand what was happening in schools, you had to understand what was happening outside of schools. You had to understand what was happening in the communities where kids lived. You had to understand why school failure is so pervasive wherever poor children are concentrated in this country. Right? And unpack that. Because that narrative for failure almost always is explained by what? It's explained either by an assumption that the problem is the children, right? That they're just simply not smart enough, not capable, come from a culture of poverty, right? Or their parents, or now, more recently, the educators who serve them. Right? And this has increasingly become their narrative, right? That it's the problem is we just got Michelle Rhee's language, fire the bad teachers, that'll solve this. Right? As if there are good teachers waiting for their chance, right? So you can't even tell you who a good one is a bad one. They don't even know, really. But these are the narratives we hear, and this is what the world I came into as a sociologist studying education. And I started my work, and no one told me that it's not a good idea as a brand new assistant professor to serve on the school board. Right? Except for a senior colleague who said, you know, you will never get tenure if you do this. And I did it anyway, not because I was interested in politics, but because I was being asked. They said, we need a voice on the board. You're here. And I said, okay. Now I realized a month into the job that was a mistake. The school board is usually not where you make a lot of change. School board is where you manage the miserable status quo. But I learned so much about policy and the constraints created by policy during those 4 years. No one told me as a brand new assistant professor that I shouldn't teach high school simultaneously. Right? But I did for 3 years. Because I felt that if I'm going to be in the field of education, I actually have to know what's going on in schools. Right? Wow, what a radical idea, right? That you can't really study something if you never taught, you don't know what's going on in the world of schools. Right? And I taught at a school, what they call in California, a continuation school. Right? A school for the kids who've been kicked out of the traditional schools. Right? It was a dumping ground for bad kids, bad teachers, as they assumed them to be. And that's where I did my work. And there, what did I focus on? I focused on the issues that were of critical concern to my students, to that school, to that community. I focused on the plight of African American Latino males. This was in the 1990s, many years before Brothers Keeper. Right? Why? Because these are not new issues. Early 90s, this was when youth violence was at its height in this country, at its height. How many of you saw Menace to Society? Right? Okay. Reflection of the times. And I was trying to understand, how do we convince young people who are caught up in the violence, who are caught up in the drug trade, to stay back in school, how do we make education relevant to them? Because I felt that education had to be part of a strategy to counter these other influences. Right? I started studying racial disparities in schools, what we now call the achievement gap. Right? I started studying that in 1996 at Berkeley High School. Before it was, No Child Behind was even in place. Why? Because the disparities were already there. And I wanted to understand how it was possible that a liberal, progressive community, first in the country to voluntarily integrate schools, why it was having so much trouble educating children of color. What was that about? What was there about the way the school was organized? What was there about power and privilege that made it so difficult for children of color to get a decent education in this liberal community? And so the issues I focused on were the issues I saw. And so when I meet graduate students who are having trouble figuring out what to study, I said, go out into the community, talk to people, figure out what they're concerned about. Right? Because you've got to make sure that your work is timely, that it matters, not just to you, but to the broader public. And so I encourage you to really think about, how do we do work that makes a difference, right? And not simply work that advances our careers. In doing that work, it's important to not avoid theory. Why is that? Ideas matter. Right? They really matter. As I said, what's the prevailing narrative for why we have an achievement gap? Think about the way it's framed as an achievement gap, right? So narrow, as if it was just about gaps in academic achievement on test scores and grades or graduation rates. Well, if you have a different theoretical lens, you start to realize, wow, you know what's driving this achievement gap? Inequality is driving the achievement gap. Now, we know there's empirical evidence out there that shows strongest predictor for how well a child will do in school is family income. James Coleman showed that in 1966. That's been true for years. And we know that if you know how much education the parents had, particularly the mother, because the mother is the child's first teacher, and you combine that with family income, you can predict with great consistency how well a child will do. What does that suggest? It suggests the backgrounds of our kids are driving these patterns. But it goes further than that, it goes deeper, and we got to unpack the layers deeper, because what else do we know? We know that we are one of few countries in the world that consistently spends more money to educate wealthy children than poor children. Wow, how come the allocation gap is not seen as part of the problem, contributing to unequal outcomes? We have this debate right now about charter schools versus public schools. And I try not to take a simplistic position, because if I see a charter school that's good, I want to know, why is it good, right? And I want to understand why it's good. But if one of the reasons why it's good is because it's spending more money than public schools, I want to expose that too. Because that shows this is what it really costs. These are the kind of investments we really need to make. Theory is what enables me to change the narrative, to ask a different set of questions. As I said earlier, I'm a sociologist. And as a sociologist, I have for years been preoccupied by this relationship between structure and culture. Right? I'm very aware, because I started as a student in the 1980s, right after Julius Wilson produced his book, The Declining Significance of Race. Very controversial book at the time. Right? Because Wilson argued that in the post-civil rights era, it was the structural changes, rather than simply race, that was producing this inequality. And he did his work in Chicago, and he talked about the way in which deindustrialization, the way in which civil rights had made it possible for the black middle class to escape poor black communities, and the way in which political changes in our political economy, right, that ended up punishing the poor, how that created what he called social isolation of the poor and the truly disadvantaged. Right? And he went on to show through 3, 4 books, and he's still producing, he's in his late 80s, and he's still active, that these structural changes end up having cultural consequences. Right? Because when work disappears, the name of his 3rd book, what happens? Despair festers. Violence festers. He shows, for example, that black and white men have very different rates when they are not living with the mother of their children, of supporting their children. Black men 8 times more likely not to support their children unless you control for income. If you control for income, they support the children at the same rate. Wow, having a job matters. You know, right now in South Carolina, it's just come out in the last few weeks because, what's the name of the man who was shot by the police? Walter Scott. Walter Scott was running because he had already served time for not paying child support. Lost his job because he couldn't pay child support. They literally, 1 out of 8 inmates right now, 1 out of 6 in South Carolina are there for not paying child support. It's a debtor's prison. Right? Exposing how that works, how structure works to shape behavior is critical importance, because Americans especially ignore culture, are blind to ignore structure, are blind to the way that the structure influences opportunities, are blind to the ways that these barriers relate to race and class. drive unequal outcomes. Even in a society that claims to be democratic, even in a society that claims to have a level playing field, structure continues to shape our reality. Read the new Brookings report about the slumburbs. Right? About, in fact, increasingly, the face of poverty is less and less urban, it's now suburban. That's what Ferguson represents. Right? And if you look at Chicago and you look at New York, look at this neighborhood. For those of you going to school here, there used to be a long time when they used to tell you, if you go to school, teachers college, do not go down to the park over there. They kill people. They bribe people over there. Now you go there, it's like a different world. Right? All kinds of kids, mostly white. Right? In that park, nowadays, when you see a white woman running through Harlem, she's probably just jogging. Right? Things have changed. But as they change, so does, we have to understand the nature of the change. There are winners and losers being produced. Because the people who have been priced out of Harlem are ending up where? They're ending up upstate in Newburgh. How many know Newburgh? Newburgh's a little Bronx, upstate, right? With gangs and all kinds of social problems, and in many ways worse than the Bronx. Why? Because they don't even have bus service, right? They don't have the social service at least you had in the city. They don't have in places like Newburgh or Schenectady. So we've got to be researchers who are aware of what's going on around us, who are documenting and studying and digging deep to understand. You know, I've been studying, for example, the problems facing African American Latino boys. We've been sticking with this for a while. What's the common narrative out there? What's the narrative even behind Brother's Keeper? I would say the narrative is the problem is the kids. And you actually hear it in some of the president's statements. You know, pull your pants up, right? As if just pulling your pants up will change everything. Pull your pants up and you will get a job. Pull your pants up, your grades will rise, right? It's a simplistic narrative and completely ignores the structure of opportunity. It completely ignores. This is why I try to, some of you may know Roland Fryer. Roland Fryer is an economist at Harvard. Got a lot of money from the Broad Foundation to study, he has something called Ed Labs, to study educational innovations. One of the great innovations he came up with a few years ago, got a lot of attention, was the idea that we should pay kids for higher grades, pay kids for better test scores, pay them to read. And they did it. They did it in New York, they did it in Chicago, Dallas, DC. And while the experiment was going on, he and I appeared on CNN debating it. The first question I asked is, how many kids will you pay? And how long will you pay them? And he couldn't answer the question. I said, second of all, why don't you go to the schools right now where black kids are achieving and they're not getting paid? Why don't you look at those schools? And he looked at me with surprise. He didn't know those schools exist. Guess what? Those schools exist. Those schools show us that under the right conditions, black and Latino males can thrive. They can excel. You don't have to change their culture. You don't have to manipulate take them away from their parents. You don't have to give them shots or drug them. You just have to change the environment, change the opportunities available to them, change the relationships with their teachers. And lo and behold, the same kids can do far better than they were. I had a group of educators that had heard me speak down in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And after the presentation, they came to see me and they said, you know what, we've been teaching in Alabama for many years and we have never seen a school where African American kids do well. I said, well, that's a problem. Because if you've never seen it done, after a while you think it can't be done. I said, well, come visit me in New York, and they did. I took them to Medgar Evers Prep, I took them to Hillcrest in Queens. I said, I could take you to several others. And they were blown away. Because Medgar Evers Prep, they're all black. And it's a high-achieving school. They said, wow, didn't know a school like this existed. And talking to the kids, they were blown away by their intelligence, by their motivation, by their commitment. Because those kids not only have higher test scores, those kids have higher aspirations. They have a different sense of themselves because of where they go to school. And that's the reason why we've got to also engage these cultural arguments, right, that keep coming back. Right? This semester I had my students read Orlando Patterson's new book called The Cultural Matrix. Right? I got two of my students here today. They could testify. All 760 pages of it, right? Because I'd started reading it. I said, oh, this is worth a read. Oh, I'm running out of time. I better go faster. And we invited Patterson up to come and talk to us. And then to give a presentation, because I thought someone needs to try to make him be accountable for what he's saying here. And lo and behold, although he tries in many ways to not simply manufacture the old cultural arguments of the cultural pathology, right, it ends up showing up anyway, right, in the way he's looking, particularly at disconnected youth. You know? And so I was just asked by the American Sociological Association Journal if I would do a book review of his book, and I got so many other things to write, I said, yes, I'll do it. Why? Because I feel that he has to be taken on in print, too. Right? And we have to take him on not just by calling him names, but actually engaging the ideas. So that's part of your work too. Engage the ideas. Don't run away from ideas you don't like. Take them on. Critique them thoroughly. There's a good piece. Many of you know about this debate going on right now between Cornel West and Michael Dyson. If you don't, read the articles. I thought Dyson was thorough. I thought West's response was not. And I would also say, if you throw rocks, you better get ready for some rocks to be thrown back. Now, Cornel, I admire, he's a friend, but he's been throwing rocks. Throwing them at Melissa Harris Perry and at Dyson and at the president. Now, I occasionally throw some rocks myself, but I always substantiate why I'm throwing the rocks, okay? I try not to make it personal. But this new piece in the New Republic, it's called Ideas Matter. And it's worth to have a debate. It's worth to flesh out the ideas. Right? Think about the debate between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. It got acrimonious, it got ugly, but it was fleshing out two important positions about which direction to go. Right? So we need sometimes to have a healthy, civil debate. Civil debate. Something that doesn't get modeled very often in this country. Right? But I encourage you to read. I encourage you to not be afraid of engaging ideas. I had a debate with John McWhorter. How many of you know John McWhorter? Right? After he published his book, Losing the Race. Now, he doesn't want to debate me anymore. Because I read his book, and I could tear him apart. But I'm not personal. Not personal. I don't care about his personal choices or who he sleeps with or anything else. It's about what those ideas are, what they represent, right? So let's not be afraid of that. Let's also not be afraid. There's a debate that goes on in education between the left, right, what I call the pessimist, that basically take the position nothing can change until capitalism is gone, right? And then what I call the naive optimist, right? Who ignore poverty, who ignore inequality, who say, just study harder. Right? Well, I say we got to be able to navigate that debate too. Dig in there. We got kids coming to school every day. How do you create schools that succeed in serving kids amidst poverty, despite all the huge challenges? What does that education need to look like? Where does agency fit into that discussion? Right? There are so many possibilities for scholarship that's important, for scholarship that matters. And I encourage you as young scholars and practitioners to take it on. So in my closing comments, first thing I would say is something I heard once from a colleague who just died, Norton Grubb, who's a professor of economics at Berkeley. And a student had gone to see him, and she told him he asked her what she wanted to study, and she told him, and basically she wanted to study Latinas in higher education who are lesbian. And he said to her, I'll be happy when I meet a student of color who's interested in studying something other than himself. And she ran down to me in tears. And she said, what a mean asshole he is. I said, yeah, he is a mean asshole. But think about what he just said to you. Because he's right. Not to say that we can't study ourselves, because sometimes studying our experience is important. If we don't study it, no one else is studying it. But we can't be content to only study that. Because if we only study ourselves, then who's studying the big issues, like school funding, like school reform, these big issues that are shaping the experiences of our kids? If we're just focused on ourselves, we're saying, you folks study us. You folks decide what will happen. So don't be afraid and don't be content with simply focusing narrowly on identity. Right? I would also say, be willing to bridge the gap between research and practice. Be willing to do work that you engage practitioners and make relevant to practitioners. Don't be content with publishing in a refereed journal that no one's going to read except for people who are in your field. Do work that's going to be relevant to educators. Do work that's going to be relevant to students and parents. You know who's a great model for that? Ernest Morrell here. Been doing that work for years. Showing you can actually engage students and empower students by engaging them as collaborators in the research. Right? So there are possibilities for doing work that's important if we have the imagination to take it on. Lastly, keep thinking about how you can do work that will make a difference. There's a reason why I write op-eds, and it's not because I have a whole lot of time. I usually don't, right? I do it because every once in a while something is so outrageous, like that cheating scandal in Atlanta and the judges' verdicts, that I can't just sit back and say, what a damn shame, right? I gotta put pen to paper. Be willing to engage. Be willing to write. Be willing to speak out. Use your position of privilege to speak out for the rights of those who don't have the time, who don't have the platform, who don't have the voice for whatever reason. Be willing to do that too. These are critical times. There'll be a huge protest in Baltimore today about the most recent killing, right, of yet another unarmed black man. And I was trying to engage some of the activists here in New York, and I was saying, look, the Black Lives Matter movement is so important because it's showing a response to these police killings, but it needs to do more than protest. Because protest is not sustainable. After a while, it gets cold. After a while, people get tired. After a while, people got to go to work or raise their kids. You can't build a movement by protest alone. If you watch the movie Selma, which only gave you a small snippet of a movement, you realize that there was more to that movement than simply protesting on the bridge. There was all the educational work that went on. And as educators and scholars, that's where we come in. To help the public know why whether or not you're a black life, it still matters. When police are allowed to kill people with impunity, our whole democracy is in jeopardy. And that's what a lot of people don't realize. This is not just about black men. It's about everyone in this country. And we've got to help them to recognize that too. So there's so much to be done. And I appreciate the fact that you've come out on a Saturday to do it, and I thank you all for inviting me and having me to be part of the conversation. Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm definitely in agreement with you all, but we're not done yet. We're gonna do Q&A. So if anyone has questions, they can come to this mic over here and line up. And we have about 20 minutes for questioning. So please, if you have any questions.
I really want to thank you for, this very powerful presentation this morning. And one of the things that I kind of wanted to engage you with was about in your research and looking at young people today and how they communicate and interact in this new age where, yes, there is this kind of social disconnect, but also there is this, this connect through media, right? And that we are using both new tools to communicate and empower ourselves and address these issues, but also to educate ourselves as, the very quickly, the very, existence and growing field of e-learning, right, as a possibility. and the possibility of the communiversity, because I love that you say that, you know what, you have to bring that out to the community. In what you're seeing in terms of, you know, social behaviors within schools and in the community, has there been any real evidence tying, you know, what we're looking at in the future in terms of education and social connectedness that is worth noting?
Oh yeah, I think there's a lot. So for example, right now, for a number of reasons, mostly because the Civil Rights Department is ready to put sanctions on districts that have too high racial disproportionality suspension rates. There are a lot of districts around the country that are basically saying, New York, one of them, we're going to reduce suspensions. And they just send out mandates to principals, reduce them, right? But think about how simplistic that is, right? I was listening to the, I was on a commission 2 years ago. We were talking to the principals of the 2 high schools in New York that had the highest suspension rates, Boys and Girls High School and DeWitt Clinton, right? And now what else do we know about those schools? Those schools are struggling schools. Why are they struggling? They're serving the most disadvantaged kids, right? Principal of Boys and Girls said, I suspend because I lack other tools, right? So they said, what do you mean by that? He said, I'll give you an example. I have a student that came to me a couple weeks ago. He'd just been released from Rikers Island, shows up at my school to register. I said, well, he's demonstrating a lot of initiative. I'm going to give him a chance. Lets him in. That day, he gets into 2 fights, punches a teacher in the face. At the end of the day, he finds out he's bipolar, not on his medication. He said, why didn't someone from Rikers let me know he was coming without his meds? Right? He said, if I had a social worker to work with this young man, we might be able to provide support for him. I have no social worker. So my concern is that now we got schools focused on this issue of discipline. Now we got to shift the focus away from simply reducing suspensions on how to improve the relationships and how to build the structures and supports so that kids can be successful, because kids need to be, everybody needs to be in a safe and orderly environment, right? That, again, allows us to address the behavior in a different context and simply say, don't suspend, right? So I think these are moments when we have to seize these opportunities.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your fantastic presentation. My name is Randolph Scott McLaughlin. I'm a second year in the Counseling Psychology doctoral program here at TC. And one of the questions I would like to ask you is, for a person who would like to eventually move into academia, whose research is related to the impact of African-American fatherhood being in prison and the impact it has on their families on the outside, and looking at that from a practical practitioner lens, but through a research lens as well, that research being so close to me, it can take a toll on a person. And what I'm asking is, how do you balance the importance of your work, the importance of moving toward Black Lives Matter becoming not just a protest, but an actual movement? How would you recommend for a student who hasn't quite gotten their stamp yet manage that?
Good question. So I think it's a very important topic, a topic that's been understudied, right? So, and that's always a good thing to take on, something that not a lot of people looked at. I would then ask, who else has looked at this research? Who's done the best research that's related even to this? What were their methods? And what kind of connections did they make between the study of incarceration and its impact on children and policy, for example, right? Because that will give you insights into how to go about the work, so that you don't just get immersed within the story of the anguish and the pain that's created by the separation, but you get to look at the larger issue of mass incarceration, right? And how those policies are being perpetuated, why they're being perpetuated. So I would spend time in that review of the literature to really look at who's doing that. I could actually, if you email me, I could maybe suggest to a couple people too.
I would love to, thank you.
Hola, Pedro.
Hola, ¿cómo estás?
Todo bien. Basically, we met a few years ago, and at that time, I don't know if you noticed, I am an immigrant, and I came to this country, and I learned here about the 66, all this data showing all the issues. 66. I was born in 65. And I was so overwhelmed to know that scholarly new, and here we are, and we are still struggling with the same issues. And my question is, what do you think is happening that people don't see?
Well, it's a big one. You know, if you watch the news, then you get it right away why they don't see, right? How do the issues get framed? How do they get presented, right? I mean, think about the irony, just on the question of immigration. We are a nation of immigrants. The first undocumented people were who? The Pilgrims, right? Mm-hmm. They didn't have any papers. I mean, so think about the hypocrisy. Our whole economy is dependent on immigrant labor. But we allow millions of people to live as fugitives. What country does that? It's not even our interest to do it, right? So part of, I think, the work is to try to challenge the narrative about who the immigrants are. You know, I just saw a study the other day. Over a third of undocumented people in this country own their own homes. Not only are they paying taxes, they own their own homes. So they are, talk about contributing to the society, right? Mm-hmm. So that's, again, where research is needed to, again, to reshape it. I spent a lot of time in schools that are serving recent immigrants, including the undocumented, extremely well. And I show how it's, again, the problem is not the kids. The problem is how we build the capacity in schools to meet the needs of kids. So again, there's a lot of room for scholars who are moved by a concern of what's happening out there to do good work that helps to highlight what's possible and change the narrative. That's our work, change the narrative.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed hearing you speak. You talked about the sort of ongoing debate between structure and culture and gave a little bit of history about it, which was really helpful. And I was wondering, so this year is the 50th anniversary of the Moynihan Report, and I was reading over it recently and noticing just how much data was in it and how most of it was just charts and numbers. And fast forward to now, I find that in conversations, both as a teacher and now here at Teachers College, about education and shifting the conversation, sort of big data always comes up. Mm-hmm. And you brought up this idea of shifting the conversation to places that we're not looking, like the allocation gap, which was really compelling. But how do you what's your advice on how to do that, especially in settings where the big data that says the test scores matter or this or that more, how do you start to shift the conversation toward questions like that?
Well, that's why it's so important to kind of read widely, right, so that you can challenge it. So, you know, so for example, I just had a student studying grading practices of middle school teachers, right? And she's done this work at schools in New York. And one of the things that's so interesting about grading is how arbitrary it is, right? You know, teachers are grading kids on effort, on attendance, on attitude. But guess what? Grades are a better predictor for how well you'll do in school and in college than test scores. And that, we've known that for a while. So in this whole debate about test scores and testing, right? And think about it now, right? We're testing kids in the spring. We're giving the teachers the results in the fall when they no longer have the kids, right? So we're using testing largely for the purpose of measuring and ranking. And we're assuming that the test score is an accurate reflection of what a child can do. Ask kids, how many of them are actually taking the test seriously? The ones who show up, are actually working hard. Ask the teachers, how many of you actually taught the material that's going to be on the test to your students? I mean, the whole thing is an abuse. So when we're in those conversations about the big data, ask the questions. What do we really know about these tests and what they represent? What else do we know about a child's performance? So again, it's about shifting the lens we use to make decisions and to formulate policies, because I would say we've allowed economists to have far too much influence on what we're doing in education, and you know it shows, right? Because there's a lot that educators know about children, you know, that's about more than just test scores. Think about this. I mean, you know, and it's a shame, but the people who used to be highly influential in education, people like Howard Gardner and James Comer, no longer influential, right? And both of them said, look, you need a much more holistic view of a child to educate them, right? You got to think about child development. You got to think about, I mean, Gardner points out it was common in this country for every kindergarten classroom to have a piano up until the 1960s. Why? Because we got it. Music's the foundation for learning, right? Well, it still is. How many of you know kids that have memorized the lyrics to hundreds of songs? Right? What does it tell you about the capacity to retain information if they want to, and if we use methods that are conducive with the way they learn? So there's a lot about learning that we ignore, right? And that we need to challenge those who are setting policy or are also ignoring, because they don't even know.
Hi, good afternoon. Well, thank you for everything that you said. It was very meaningful. But what I'm wondering, particularly when you were talking about Newburgh, so I was born and raised in New York City, and I've seen the gentrification happen. And I mean, it hasn't happened as fast as in other places around the country, but it's happening. What I'm curious about is the relationship between school closures and chartering in New York City and that residential well, gentrification, but the pushing out of our communities. What are the implications for our schools? But also, what are the implications for the culture of the communities that we built and us being displaced from them?
Good questions. That's a great project. but don't, you know, what I would encourage you to do, don't come into it. Like you see a lot of scholars who come into a project like that already thinking, I know the answer, now I'm just going to look for evidence to back it up, right? That's why I say it's better to take an inductive approach, right? Where you what is the relationship between the growth of charter schools and gentrification? How would I go about understanding and exploring that, right? Some of the stuff that's out there I don't think is that helpful because you can see already the bias of the researcher influencing everything they look at and what they don't look at, right? So I'd encourage you to be willing to do research that actually allows you to be surprised too, right? Because you might see some things that you hadn't anticipated. So, but it's a great project.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, my name is Buster. I'm from Middletown, Connecticut. And mentioning Howard Gardner, is he the multiple intelligence theory guy? Yeah. Okay. So, yes, all right. So, would you please comment upon possible intersections between the role of hip-hop in schools and multiple intelligence theory? In any way you'd like.
Another big question. Well, we got the hip-hop specialists over here. They're actually doing, you guys doing another workshop later? Oh, it's too bad. But I would encourage you to connect with them. I don't pretend to be a hip-hop scholar at all. I have an appreciation for the scholarship that's being done on it. And I think it's important because I think that they realize, here we have a medium that is reaching kids in powerful ways, right? That is for too long been ignored by lots of educators. Right? Now there is great work of educators who are starting to realize, no, there's so many things they can use hip-hop for to deepen engagement, to deepen learning. So I would just encourage you to read some of that work. Check with these two right here to get there. They can give you a whole syllabus of great scholarship that's coming out now. I just had, I can't even remember his name, a guy interviewed me writing about Kendrick Lamar's new album and what the messages it says for kids and how teachers can use this as a way to get kids thinking critically and thinking deeply about society. So I think there are rich opportunities there that, guess what, align with the Common Core standards. That is, that really force kids to think at the higher levels, right? Which is what Common Core should do, right? That I think we should take advantage of. One more. I'll stick around for a little while.
Okay. It's really great to be here with you because I was lucky enough in my graduate program to be assigned your books, so it's pretty cool. I'm a teacher. It's my 6th year in public schools. I've only taught in schools that served, I guess, poor, underprivileged youth and children of color, and I'm tired and I want to quit because I can't work with the administration. It's the subjective evaluation that's now implemented and power tripping. Mostly I've only worked for white women or white men, and it's just, you know, when I make an argument about why George Washington Carver is a good resource to teach about selective breeding and using, because I teach science, my administrator stares me dead hard in the face and says, use the textbook and only the textbook, and writes me an ineffective evaluation. And it's really hard, and I don't want to do it anymore. So I'm wondering, what can I do? Because people don't leave progressive schools.
Yeah.
They're all filled. I mean, so.
Well, so I certainly hear your anguish and understand it. I would say this, and how many principals are here today? I know there's at least a couple, right? Talk to them, they might have openings. You know, we live in New York City. There's over 1,800 schools, right? And so that gives you a lot of options. Yeah. So, you know, if you're at a school where they don't value the kind of work you're doing, I bet you there are others that would be happy to have you. Now, too bad for those kids that they're going to lose you, right?
Yeah, true.
But that's unfortunately something you don't control right now as a teacher where you are. So I would encourage you not to give up, but simply to find a better place to work. You know, when I started teaching, one of the things I appreciated was the fact once the door closed, I had all the power and all the freedom. Yeah. Increasingly now, teachers don't have that because they got a curriculum police going by to make sure they're on the right page. You know, that's again another one of the constraints we're working under. So hopefully you can find a place that will value what you do and what you bring.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And thank you all. Hope you have a great conference.
Thank you, Dr. Nogueira, for such an amazing address. And we just want to give you a small token of our appreciation. Isn't it cute? In sincere appreciation of Dr. Pedro Nogueira, keynote speaker for the 6th Annual Diversity in Research and Practice Conference presented by the Black Student Network at Teachers College, Columbia University. The secret in education lies in respecting the student, Ralph Waldo Emerson. So we're about to head into lunch, but I just want to outline, if you guys look at your programs, you'll see all the different presentations we have today, and we also have an amazing panel that's going to be later in the evening. And also I wanted to acknowledge, I forgot to earlier, that we have our past chair of the conference, Alan Wright. So give him